Hey there! This video is a review of the Canon Powershot V1, a very impressive little camera from Canon with a lot of cool tech and features and a really small and fun to use form factor. Now I will get into my normal detailed nerdy technical review later on in the video, but of course it is a beautiful day here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I want to get out and do a little bit of filming with the camera. But before we get into the rest of the video, a little bit of a disclaimer. This camera was sent to me on loan from B&H Photo. They've been a huge supporter of the channel and they send me stuff so I can test out and review it and make videos like this for all of you. So if you have some camera gear that you're looking to pick up, please go check out B&H Photo. There are links in the description for the Powershot V1 and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So huge thanks to B&H Photo for making videos like this possible. It is a beautiful spring day here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm out walking around in this beautiful park. Capture sample footage for you. So let's take a look at that and then we'll get into the rest of the review. So all of the sample footage that you just saw was shot on the Powershot V1 in 4K 24 in C-Log3. So there are several cool things to nerd out about with this camera, but the big ones being the ability to record in 4K 10-bit 422 in C-Log3, the fact that it has a built-in ND filter and a cooling fan, and those are all really impressive features for a point-and-shoot camera. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Josh, and I am a videographer and a content creator, and I like to do deep dive technical reviews and tutorials, so if you're into that kind of stuff, then you're in the right place. I will focus exclusively on video in this video because I don't really do much photography. I will go over more general stuff earlier on in the video, and then get into the nerdy deep dive testing, which I love to do later on in the video. There are chapter markers down below if you'd like to skip around. Now I know this is a point and shoot camera really designed for simplicity and ease of use, but I really wanted to push this camera really hard and see how good it is. First of all, the image quality, which you already saw with the sample footage. I think this camera produces a really nice image. Because it can also shoot in C-Log3, you get a lot of dynamic range, and C-Log3 is very easy to grade and it has a lot of latitude. So overall, I was really impressed with the image quality that comes out of this camera. Next, let's talk about the sensor that's in this camera. It is a 1.4-inch sensor. So when you're shooting stills, it's 22.3 megapixels, but when you're shooting video, it crops the top and the bottom to give you 18.7 megapixels. This actually results, though, in a 4K image that's oversampled from 5.7K, so you get a very detailed and crisp, sharp image when you get that oversampling. And when you do oversample, it also gets rid of a lot of the noise and gets just a cleaner image in general. If you're unfamiliar with sensor sizes, 1.4-inch sensor is roughly 18.4 millimeters by 12.3 millimeters, and a full frame sensor is 36 by 24. So this sensor, the 1.4-inch sensor, is just slightly wider than Micro Four Thirds, which has the ratios of 17.3 to 13 millimeters. And Micro Four Thirds roughly has a 2x crop, but it is a 4:3 aspect ratio, whereas this camera has a 3:2 aspect ratio. So depending on what you're doing, but a lot of people do like 3:2 for photos. So it does crop a little bit horizontally in video, so you get a little bit less than a 2x crop in photo, but when you are shooting in video, you get a little bit more than a 2x crop. But if you just don't want to think about it too much, the sensor basically gives you a 2x crop from what you'd get from full frame. So in terms of resolution, frame rates, and codecs, you can shoot 4K up to 30 frames per second in the full width, and you can shoot that in IPB or IPB Lite. Now IPB is no problem whatsoever. I shoot most of my stuff in IPB or long op on most of my cameras to save on data, so you get a really nice image quality. And you can also shoot in 4K 60, but it is a crop mode, so that is a 1.4 times crop. All right, now let's talk about overheating and run times. And if you are familiar with this channel, you know I always like to test out cameras to see how long they run for. As a videographer, if a camera is going to overheat in high temperatures or long run times, it's going to be a problem for me for, doing the job that I need to do. So I always like to test this out. Now, the cool thing about this camera, like I said, this has an actual fan in it, so it has active cooling. And so for all of these tests, I did them in the studio. There was one tested outside, but my studio here is around 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I always had the screen open. I had it on a tripod to get the maximum airflow. I had the auto power off temperature set to high and the fan speed set to auto to give the maximum cooling potential and longest run times. First up is the baseline test. This is 4K 24 here in the studio, and it ran for 1 hour and 26 minutes when the battery died, and the overheating meter was only at 2 of 10, so no real issues at 4K 24 in the studio. Next up was 4K 60 in the studio. The camera ran for 1 hour and 3 minutes when the battery died, so a little bit less than 4K 24, and the overheating meter was at 4 of 10. So no real issues of overheating here in the studio. Then I ran it outside. It was 85 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun. It ran for 1 hour and 22 minutes when the battery died. The overheating meter was at 8 of 10, but it didn't overheat, which is awesome to hear. Next, I want to talk about studio use, long-form recording, podcasting, and live streaming. So when I use a camera in a studio environment or for podcasting or any long-form recording, there's a couple things I do. First of all is I usually plug in USB-C power delivery so the camera will run indefinitely. And then I often have HDMI plugged in so I can monitor what I'm doing or send it out to a computer for a live stream and all those sorts of things. So I wanted to test those out and see how it did. First up is the 4K 24 test here in the studio, and I did this with HDMI out and USB-C power delivery, and the camera ran until the card filled up at 3 hours and 20 minutes, and the overheating meter was only at 5 of 10. Then I tested the camera with USB streaming. This is at 1080p 30, and the camera ran for 6 hours with no overheating warnings whatsoever. So in the studio, I really didn't have any issues. Now, I didn't test the 4K HDMI out of this camera while doing all that, so your mileage may vary with that. But in a controlled environment here in my studio, which is, like I said, generally between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, if you are recording internally and spitting out 1080 over HDMI with USB-C power delivery coming in, or using the USB webcam out to your computer, no issues with overheating. Next, let's talk about the lens, because this camera has a built-in zoom lens, so it is important to talk about because you cannot change the lens on this camera. So it has a 16 to 50 millimeter full frame equivalent lens, and the minimum aperture range is f2.8 to 4.5. Now, Canon says that when you are shooting video on this, you get a 17 to 52 millimeter full frame equivalence. So not a super fast lens, but you do have a good amount of range, and the fact that you can shoot out at 16 millimeters is great for vlogging and capturing wide angle stuff. And this lens also does have stabilization, which we will talk about later on. In terms of sharpness, I think this lens looks pretty nice. And of course, that oversampling from 5.7K to 4K definitely helps. I had no complaints about sharpness. In terms of close focus, Canon says you get 2 inches at the wide end and 5.9 inches at the tele end. Again, worked pretty well while I was out shooting. In terms of the flares, I did notice that there was quite a bit of veiling flare as you are pushing it pretty hard, and it does wash over the image and takes out a lot of contrast. In terms of the ghosting flares, it was not there wasn't a ton of them, but when you push the lens really hard, I found that the ghosting flares looked pretty cool. Now, the veiling flare is just something you have to be careful of because there is no filter threads or anything like that on the front of this lens. So as of right now, unless there's a third-party manufacturer that makes it some way to attach a filter or hood or something like that on here, you just want to be careful about that. But overall, I think it looked pretty pleasing when the camera did flare. In terms of bokeh, you got to get really close to get some good bokeh because this isn't a super fast lens. But when you get close, it does look really nice, the autofocus areas. It does have a 9 aperture blades in the lens, so the background does look pretty pleasing. In terms of chromatic aberration, I really didn't notice any, and I'm really a stickler for chromatic aberration. And I think part of this is the fact that it's not a super wide aperture on this lens. Remember, 2.8 to 4.5. Also, Canon says that it has 3 spherical elements. So overall, the image quality and performance of the lens, I thought it was pretty solid. Next, let's talk about the build quality, the ergonomics, and the usability of the camera. Overall, I think they did a fantastic job with the build quality. It does have a very rugged feel to it. It's got a decent weight. And there's a couple things that stand out right away. First of all is this thumb grip right here. And a lot of these small cameras, you have to get attachments to have a thumb grip. This one is built in. It has a really nice spot for your thumb. Of course, this is a small camera, but it's grippy and it's got this little ridge here that really does help you control the camera. And onto the front in terms of the grip, yes, it is a small camera, but this does have a little grip, and just the material is very grippy and very nice to hold. So overall, I do really like the feel and build quality of this camera. So starting with the front of the camera, of course, we have our lens, and we also have a tally light here. So this is really cool to have a tally light for shooting video. I think it was a really great addition, especially when you're filming yourself. You can definitely make sure that you are rolling. And like I said, this is, of course, is a point and shoot camera. So you do have the lens that sticks out, but when you do turn it off and the lens gets pulled up, sucked in, this is very compact and very easy to put in your pocket. So that is really cool to see. All right, so onto the top of the camera, we have our shoe up here and we have our mic array under here. It does come with this little dead cat that slides in the shoe to help with wind protection, and I found it did work pretty well. All the audio that you heard at the very beginning of the video when I was out shooting was all shot with this. I think it sounded pretty good. The only thing I have to complain about this is that it kind of covers up the on-off button. And when I first put this on, I couldn't find the on-off button. So it is under there. So that's just a weird design choice, but you just have to be conscious of that. Other things on the top of the camera, we have the rocker here for the zoom, the shutter, the record button. We have the mode dial here, and then the ability to change from photo to video. So that's what's going on the top here. On the left side of the camera, we have the vents for the fan. So I believe this is the intake and the outtakes are here and here. So no ports on the left side of the camera. I think that's a sacrifice for the size of the camera, but also for the fan. Of course, I'm a fan of fans. Onto the right-hand side of the camera, we have mic, headphone, USB-C, and micro HDMI, pretty much what you expect on this camera. The fact that it's on the grip side of the camera is a little bit different. So if you are plugging things into the camera, it's probably gonna be a gimbal or tripod setup or something like that. It'd be really hard to hold on to the camera while you had stuff plugged in, but that is what it is. Onto the back of the camera, we have our flippy screen. So just as you expect, works great like most Canon screens. I can see it outside and colors seem pretty accurate. We don't have that many buttons and dials. Again, this is a pretty small camera. I think you can customize the star and the MFN button, and I have the star button set to ND filter. And we have a couple of other buttons and dials, and you can press up, down, left, and right, and in the center on the little scrolly D-pad thing over here. In terms of exposure control, there are two dials. You have this one here, and then you also have a dial on the base of the lens. And so I know this is, like I said, this is a point and shoot camera made for more automatic modes, but I'm a videographer, so I wanted as much control as possible. So the way that I ran this was my aperture, this was my shutter, and then if I wanted to change the ISO in the camera, I just touch the screen and change the ISO. I was shooting outside. So this only has a 3-stop ND filter, which we will talk about more, but I was just changing my aperture here and then having to just, maybe crank the shutter just a little bit to keep the exposure down, because you can't put ND filters or anything like that on the front of this lens. All right, now let's talk about the bottom of the camera, because I do have a few issues with the design choices here. So first of all, in the battery compartment here, we do have that smaller battery, which I mentioned before. We got, like an hour 26 in runtime in 4K 24. And we also have the memory card in here. So single SD card. That's what you expect in a camera like this. I just don't love when they're in the battery area, but I guess it is what it is. I don't know where else they would have put it. That's pretty common. But the thing that I don't like about this is that the 1/4-20 tripod plate location is right here in the middle. So when you put a tripod plate on this, you cannot open the door. And this is a problem for me because I usually have a tripod plate on there. And so I have to take it off then to get into the battery or the memory card. I've seen in the past with a lot of cameras like this, third-party manufacturers will make either cages or base plates to kind of work around this. But as is, this is kind of a bad design choice because it blocks the door. I wish it was a little bit offset or something like that. Now let's get into more of the nerdy technical testing, and we'll start with the ND filter. So like I said before, this camera has a 3-stop ND filter, which is awesome. It is a fixed hard stop ND of 3 stops, and I'll test it out and show you how well it works. But this is not a variable ND filter, so it's just on or off. Now, the way I have this set up is I have the star button here set to my ND filter on and off, so I can toggle this on or off. And you can actually hear it toggling on or off. maybe even see that on the camera there, but it's a hard ND that slides in and out. So let's take a look and see how well it works. All right, so this is with the ND filter off. I have the shutter speed at 1/400 to compensate for the 3 stops. And then what I did was I opened up the shutter speed to 1/50 and turned the ND on, so I should get roughly the same exposure. And they do look pretty similar. And then let's look at them side by side. And I really don't see much of a difference in terms of color, exposure, detail, any of those sorts of things. I think really good job with Canon getting this ND filter look really nice. And lastly, I did check this here in the studio just for in terms of colors with a color chart, and they look very, very similar. So overall, really impressed with the 3-stop ND filter in this camera. It is a huge addition to be able to keep your shutter speed down when you're shooting in bright situations. All right, next let's talk about dynamic range. And if you aren't familiar with what dynamic range is, it's the ability of a camera to capture highlight and shadow information at the same time. So whenever a camera has more dynamic range, it always looks better and you have more ability to recover information, both in terms of the highlights and the shadows. So I will do this in 2 different ways. I do a window test or a scene with a lot of dynamic range, and also a latitude test. I will be comparing the V1 with the Canon R8, which has the same sensor and image as the R6 Mark II, as well as the Canon R5 Mark II. All of these were shot in their best log profiles at the base of 800. So C-Log 3 in the V1 and the R8, and then C-Log 2 in the R5 II. All right, so here is the first window test. And the way that I do this test is I expose for the highlights without clipping, and then we'll take a look at the shadows and see what's going on. So on the left-hand side here, we have the V1 and C-Log 3, and on the right, we have the R8 and C-Log 3. These are both ungraded images right out of camera. And just to take a look here, they look pretty similar right out of camera because they're both shooting in C-Log 3. After grading them, these are done with just basic color space transforms, manipulating the luminance and contrast and saturation, but I didn't touch the colors whatsoever. I think these cameras look very similar to each other, which is actually pretty surprising considering, the V1 and the R8 are, the R8's a full frame camera and a little bit more expensive. But zooming in here to take a closer look, I think they look honestly very similar in terms of the shadows and in terms of noise and color and detail and those sorts of things. I think in terms of the shadows, these cameras are closer than I thought they would be, but we'll verify this more in the latitude test. Next, we'll take a look at the V1 in C-Log 3 on the left and the R5 II in C-Log 2 on the right. These are both ungraded. You can probably see that the R5 II has less contrast. Of course, it's shooting in C-Log 2, which is a flatter log curve. I know this is kind of an unfair test, but I do want to see how the V1 compares against Canon's, top of the line camera other than the R1. So here it is graded, and you can definitely see here, there's a difference in the shadows. The R5 II is a lot cleaner, as you'd expect, because you'd expect it to have more dynamic range. But the highlights look pretty similar between these two cameras. I don't see too much of a difference here. And zooming in, again, just sort of backing up what we said before, you can see definitely how much cleaner the shadows are on the R5 II. Of course, this is it's a $4,000 camera, but I think that the V1 definitely, looks pretty decent like we just saw against the R8. The next thing I want to show you is the latitude or push-pull test. There's a little bit of misconception about this. This is not to see if you can over or underexpose the camera, but just to see how well the camera performs in the extreme highlights and extreme shadows. And the way that I do this is I over or underexpose the image and then recover as much information as I can in post. So this really just shows you how much latitude you have in the shot. The V1 and the R8 were exposed with zebras at 35% with a gray card, which is standard exposure for C-Log 3. In the R5 II, I use C-Log 2 with false color. So here we are starting off with the overexposure test, and most cameras that I test are usually good through 3-4 stops over. These cameras, there's slight color differences. I didn't adjust them at all, but like I did before, I just graded them with color space transforms and a little bit of light grading just to correct it. Here we are at 4 stops over. They're all looking fairly similar, and at 5 stops, they all break, and I'd say that maybe the V1 looks a little bit better than the R8 here, which is pretty weird. And onto the underexposure test. Here at 0 stops, 1 stop, they all look pretty good. And now when you hit 2 stops and above, start to look at the differences between the V1 and the R8. I think they look fairly similar here. The colors are shifting differently, a little bit more green on the V1, a little bit more magenta on the R8. But overall, I would say that the V1 and R8 have similar dynamic range. Maybe even the V1 has slightly more, which is pretty weird. And I just mean ever so slightly more dynamic range than the R8. Pretty cool, pretty strong performance by the V1, and it was cool to see that. Next is the low light or high ISO test. And when I did this test, I had the high ISO noise reduction setting on all the cameras set to normal. Now, clearly the R5 II is cleaner throughout. Now, the V1, as the ISO starts increasing, definitely has a smearier looking noise pattern. And as the ISO keeps increasing, you can really see the noise reduction kicking in as my face is getting really smoothed out and the noise gets smearier or less fine. Also, it seems that there is definitely more chroma noise on the V1 as you get into the higher ISO range. This is not terrible for such a small sensor. Remember, this is a 1.4 inch sensor, but I would definitely experiment with possibly turning off the high ISO noise reduction in the camera and applying noise reduction in post if you really need to push the ISO. But I tried just generally to keep the ISO as low as possible on the V1, but it was cool to see how well it stacked up against the the R8 and the R5 II here. As you get up into the super high ISO range, I think, this is not a camera that you want to shoot that high, but here are the results. Next, talk about rolling shutter or the sensor readout speed. If you're unfamiliar, when people talk about rolling shutter, it's basically the longer the camera takes to scan the whole sensor, the more issues you have with rolling shutter artifacts. And what that is when the camera is panning quickly or when a subject is moving quickly, you can see slanted lines or some sort of like jello-y, jiggly effect. From the panning test, it's not awesome, but it's not terrible here. And testing this out here in the studio in 4K 24, I got 25.9 milliseconds, which isn't a great reading, but really not unexpected with a camera like this. The next thing is 4K 60, which does have a 1.4 times crop, so it should be a quicker readout speed here. And when I tested it, I got 16.1 milliseconds, which is what you'd expect sort of after the 25.9. But what's really weird here, if you look at this image, is that the lines in this test when I shot it are not evenly spaced. And so it appears that the sensor is reading out faster at the center than it is at the top and bottom. I'm not really sure what's going on here. I've never seen this before, but I figured I'd report it in case someone from Canon sees this or anything else. I didn't really test the rolling shutter with an actual shooting in 4K 60, and I didn't see this in 4K 24, but I definitely wanted to point it out here because I saw it. Next, we'll talk about stabilization. Now, this camera does not have IBIS or a physical sensor shift stabilization. It does have lens stabilization, and it also does have a couple different modes of electronic stabilization. So starting off, I like to do sort of a walking vlogging test. And here it is with no stabilization on whatsoever. So optical stabilization is off and the digital stabilization off, just to give you a sense of what it looks like and how shaky I am when I'm vlogging. Here I am with the lens stabilization on and the digital stabilization off. You can see that it does help quite a bit. This camera isn't super smooth as you'd expect because it doesn't have IBIS. And this is next with the optical stabilization turned on and the digital stabilization turned on. It does smooth it up quite a bit, but you can definitely see sort of my footsteps in the background with it sort of like bouncing or pulsing. And then next I have the lens stabilization on with the digital stabilization turning on enhanced, and you can see it does crop in, but does smooth it out a little bit more. So there are a few different options. And lastly, there is a subject tracking stabilization, which supposedly concentrates the image stabilization at the location of the detected subject. I didn't play around with this too much, but I did want to demonstrate what it looks like here with the same test to compare it with the other methods. Next, I wanted to do a static stabilization test. This is with no stabilization on at the long end of the lens. Here it is with the optical stabilization turned on. I think it does a really fantastic job of smoothing it out. Here is the lens stab on with the digital stabilization on, and you can see that I think it does a pretty solid job. And lastly, this is with the digital stab enhanced. In terms of autofocus, I didn't really test this too much in depth, but it seemed to be on par with the other Canon cameras I've used recently. In terms of the subject detection modes, it has auto, which I love, people, animals, or none. So there are, the general sort of standard stuff from Canon in terms of their autofocus. But I do want to talk about manual focus because that was quite a bit different with this camera. So if you want to use manual focus on this camera, you press the AF/MF button on the D-pad, change it to manual focus, and then you control the focus by pressing the up and down buttons here or using the touchscreen. So you can see it going from centimeters to meters as you go further away from the focus point, and that's how you set the manual focus. I couldn't figure out a way to set this to any of the control dials or anything like that. So manual focus isn't really great on this camera if that's something that you want to do, and I couldn't also figure out a way to zoom in to check manual focus when shooting video. All right, so now is the time where I try to wrap up this review and give you my conclusions. Let me talk about why I think this is a great option for a lot of people. I think the biggest thing with this is it has fantastic image quality. With that 1.4-inch sensor and C-Log 3, I found it to have a lot of dynamic range, and the colors are just great out of camera. I think the lens also performs really well, so fantastic image quality. In terms of the price, it's very competitive. The size is awesome. It's really compact. It fits in your pocket, especially with all the power that it has. I do like the build quality and ergonomics and all that kind of stuff. It's also really easy to use and it has reliable autofocus. This is also a fantastic studio camera if you want to use it for podcasting, live stream, or just recording long takes because of all the, because of the built-in fan, and also it has the ND filter. So just a really flexible camera that fits in your pocket. And lastly, you can also take photos with this camera. So if you're thinking about cameras like the DJI Pocket 3, which I personally love, this will take photos. So that's pretty cool. All right, so on to the price. This is $900 at the time of recording this, and I think it's extremely competitive because I honestly don't think this has much competition for point shoot cameras that shoot video. So the main competitor to this is the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, which is coming in at $900. It does have a smaller 1-inch sensor versus a 1.4-inch sensor that's in the Powershot V1, and the Sony only shoots 8-bit video, but it does have a faster or wider aperture lens with similar focal lengths. But I didn't compare them against each other, but I'd probably guess that the image quality and dynamic range is going to be superior on this camera than it is on the ZV-1 Mark II. So overall, this is a really cool camera with amazing image quality. I found it to be quite surprising and pretty incredible. So if you are looking to pick one up, there are links in the description for the V1 and, like I said, all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So I really highly appreciate you checking that out. Also, if you haven't already, please hit subscribe if you found value in this video, and hit like, and thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.